everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, a senior director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about the latest in the war between Russia and Ukraine because there were a few announcements on Monday that I would love to dive into. First, President Trump announced that he threatened Russia with what he called very severe tariffs at about 100% if a peace deal with Ukraine isn't reached in the next 50 days. He also threatened secondary tariffs, and U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, reportedly told CNN that the secondary tariffs are, quote, sanctions on countries that are buying the oil from Russia. What do you make of these sanctions and these secondary tariffs?
So I am excited. This is one of the areas I've been recommending is that we have to get stronger on holding Vladimir Putin and Russia accountable for what they do. It's not enough just to swat missiles away and things like that. We've really got to put pressure on Putin so he comes to the table. President Trump gave Vladimir Putin 6 months of runway to cease his military operations, come to the peace talks table, and enter into legitimate consensual talks with Zelensky. President Trump had previously done a maximum pressure campaign on Zelensky, brought him in, frankly, almost, I think, too much pressure. But in any case, he brought him to the table, and he gave President Putin attempt after, week after week after week of room to get this done. And in fact, President Putin would come out of these phone calls with President Trump and order up a massive drone or cruise missile attack on Ukraine. So I think President Trump showed maximum patience on this. And now he's come in with these economics actions, which, if executed, and I say if executed because they haven't occurred yet, if executed, would bring significant pressure on Russia.
Let's talk about just how significant that pressure would be, because these sanctions, the secondary sanctions at least, would go on, the secondary tariffs rather, would go on countries that are buying Russian oil, like China, like India. Is that enough for them to say, you know what, hold up, I don't want to buy oil from Russia any longer? And will, in turn, Russia feel that squeeze?
Short answer, yes. Secondary sanctions on the Chinese and Indian, and I think in the end it'll be on the companies that do, the ports, the refineries, the shipping companies that deal with the Russian shadow fleet of oil and natural gas deliverers. I think sanctions or tariffs on those companies would have a significant impact. I'm not, again, the president kind of mixed metaphors, so to speak, on sanctions and tariffs a little bit. We'll have to see what really plays out. But if you do go after those, you'll impact. And here's why. That GDP, that fossil fuel trade is what funds more than 40% of Russian GDP. I mean, it is really a big part, or at least their imports and exports, in this case, exports. It's a really big part of their economy. If you can begin to cut back on that, really cut back on it by going after China and India and their role in this, what you're going to do is force really hard decisions for President Putin. Putin will have to decide, how do I take my shrinking government funds, because my GDP is shrinking, my exports are shrinking, and how do I apply them to my federal budget? Because his budget is 40% defense and 60% kind of payments to the base. That 40% that's defense, that's like, we only spend 12% on defense. I mean, that's a significant amount. That's how he funds the war. So he'll have a choice. Do I fund the war, or do I fund kind of the payments to my base? That's a hard choice for Vladimir Putin. That's where Donald Trump can put him if he decides to impose these. I wish it wasn't 50 days from now. I wish it was 2 days from now. I wish this was like when he told Iran, I might bomb within the next 12 days or 2 weeks, and then he did it 2 days later. I wish he'd bring these now. But in any case, this is how you pressure Russia and Vladimir Putin.
And we know in a lot of situations, money does talk. Do you think in this situation, money will talk in 50 days? Either a peace deal is reached or President Putin feels that squeeze and will get to the negotiating table and perhaps get there in good faith? Or is that just being naive, thinking that Putin, economic squeeze or not, will go to the table in good faith?
Well, if I were Ukrainian, I think the next 45 days are going to involve a lot of drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. What he does with about a week to go, I'm not sure. Putin's a cagey leader. He knows how to rope a dope. I imagine with about a week to go, he'll start to pretend that he's interested in talks. I don't think that gets you there. Now look, President Trump didn't fall for this with the Iranians. He went right in on them. So maybe he'll do the same with Putin. He has set a standard with his attacks on Fordo in Iran that says I'll take action when I want to take action, and I've warned you that I might. So he's warned him that he might. I hope he still wants to take it 50 days from now, and I hope he does it.
And we've seen President Trump threaten our allies with tariffs. Now you're seeing him threatening Russia with very severe tariffs here. And he said trade is great for settling wars. Do you agree in this instance?
So I agree that sanctions or some kind of tariffs on the secondary suppliers, China and India, matters. Why? Because they trade with the United States. Russia is different. We have very little trade with Russia. So 100% sanctions, tariffs on not much doesn't lead to much pressure. So uniquely in this case, if you told me you were going to tariff North Korea or Iran or Russia, I don't think it has a big impact. If you're going to tariff China or India, it has a big impact. So the impact here is based on going after the secondary actors on the sanctions.
And you touched on this earlier in the conversation about this flip-flop almost in President Trump and his feelings towards Zelensky and Putin. Because at the end of February, we all remember that really explosive White House meeting between Vice President J.D. Vance, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and President Trump, where President Trump was just really letting Zelensky have it. And he was almost nicer in his words about Vladimir Putin. Now it's switched. Now Trump is saying, you know what? I am really angry with Putin right now. He's said out loud, kind of ruminated, is Putin leading me on here? What do you think of President Trump's in the past couple of months almost flip-flop on Putin and him publicly calling Putin out?
Well, I'll be more generous than flip. I mean, it is a flip flop, but a more generous interpretation would be that his feelings have evolved, his analysis has evolved, his assessment has evolved as Putin has acted, and Putin has acted in bad faith for 4 or 5 months. Now, you can say, look, that was a very predictable thing from Vladimir Putin. He's a bad faith actor and kind of a stone cold killer for the last 25 years. Why would we have thought things would change? But in any case, President Trump gave him more than enough time. This action, what President Trump did today, was the absolute logical outcome of President Putin's noncompliance and his kind of nasty behavior towards President Trump, President Zelensky, and the people of Ukraine.
And I want to move on to another announcement from President Trump. He said that NATO allies are going to buy billions of dollars worth of weapons from the United States and then give them to Ukraine. What do you make of that announcement?
So this one was it's good news, but I have to put it in some context, which is there's another bit of mixed metaphor here where he described it one way and Secretary General Mark Rutte of NATO Secretary General described it another. President Trump made it sound like the Europeans would come buy system. The United States would give systems to Europe, maybe Patriot missiles, Patriot batteries, and then the Europeans would buy them, buy replacements for the United States. In other words, a weird kind of presidential drawdown authority where we send stuff directly to Ukraine, and the Europeans replace it. Secretary General Rutte described something slightly different where he said, the Europeans would buy things from the United States, from I assume our defense industrial base, and in the meantime provide the equivalent stuff to the Ukrainians. In either case, good news for Ukraine, they get Patriot missiles or batteries pretty quick. The question of how you do it, whether it comes from who has the gaping, the slight hole in their system where they've given something up and they're waiting for it to be reimbursed, that's what's up in the air. I suspect it'll be mostly the second case, where the Europeans are sending their equipment and then ordering replacements from the United States, and we're kind of prioritizing delivery to them.
And either way, regardless of which way it's happening, you're saying it's good news for Ukraine, but either way that you described it, it sounds a little bit of a roundabout system. Why is that?
Well, that's a great question. It's a roundabout system because the the group part of the world that wants to give Ukraine materials now, Europe has no defense industrial base to build those systems and deliver them. And the country that does build and deliver systems and has delivered a lot to Ukraine has said, "Hey, that's enough by us." So you have this, this dichotomy where the country that's in a position to give now, or build now, is not that interested in giving at this moment. Look, I hope over time President Trump continues to refine his opinion of Ukraine and eventually goes back to either, you know, preferential loans or grant programs to directly deliver U.S. weapons. But for now, the Europeans buying those weapons from us and then delivering their own is fine by me.
And what are you looking out for, especially in the next 50 days? Because that's a firm deadline we have. As of now, that's a firm deadline of what we have now of President Trump saying, hey, Russia, either peace deal in the next 50 days or we are going to tariff you. Do you think that A, is a serious threat, B, Russia will actually respond? I mean, what are you looking out for? I know you said the week before, that's when you're really going to see some action, but what other signposts are you keeping your eye out on?
Aspirationally, I can hope that you see a decreasing of Russian attacks, either Shahed drone, or cruise and ballistic missile. Realistically, I don't think you'll see that. But if you were to see that, that would be an indication. If you're to see the Russians stop their tactical offensives in small areas where they gain a square kilometer here or there every couple of weeks, that would be a signal. I don't think we're going to see either of those. I think Russia will continue for the next 4 to 5 weeks minimum, their offensive campaigning to see if they can get a breakthrough. Because in the end, that's truly what Vladimir Putin wants: a breakthrough on the lines, a salient that he can penetrate and get more significant territorial gains from Ukraine and place Kiev or Odessa at risk. Those are the two major Ukrainian cities. I don't think that's likely. I've told you before, I work closely with the Ukrainians, and they're not going to lose this war. I don't know that they know how to win it. I don't either, but they're not going to lose it. They're just going to lose a lot more people defending themselves. I think the actions that we heard President Trump avert to today will mean less Ukrainian casualties over time.
And to that point, then, do you think today the Ukrainians are thinking after these two announcements, hey, we're a little closer to winning this war, we're a little closer to this war coming to a conclusion? What exactly are they thinking?
I think they do probably think they're a little closer to the war coming to conclusion, not winning. Look, they'd like to hear a third line of effort. They want to hear President Trump say, I'm willing to provide offensive weapon systems to Ukraine so they can hold Russian command and control and logistics movements at risk, deep inside Ukrainian, Russian occupied Ukraine, or even in Russia itself. And the weapon system for that's called the ATACMS. President Biden provided that 2 years ago, but put significant restrictions on it that made sure it never really worked as advertised. President Trump should give the Ukrainians ATACMS with no limitations and allow them to strike Russian military assets and maneuvering and consolidated assets before they maneuver, deep in Russian-held Ukraine or in Russia. And to me, if he did that, that is where Ukraine starts to think they can win. Now, again, I don't think there's a path for them to actually win, but they'll be much more optimistic based on that.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for. And per usual, I always appreciate your expertise and your insight here. Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you for having me.